for at least a half century, we have been spectacularly blind to the importance of group identity. We tend to view the world in terms of these great ideological battles: communism versus capitalism, democracy versus authoritarianism, and most recently, the free world against the axis of evil. Blinded by these ideological prisms, we have repeatedly ignored the more primal group identities, which for billions are the ones that are most powerful and important to them, and which drive political upheaval all over the world. This blindness has led to some of our greatest foreign policy disasters in the last 50 years. I would probably say all of them. So, take Vietnam. We saw everything through a Cold War lens. We saw ourselves as fighting a great enemy, communism, and the idea was that if little Vietnam fell, the whole region, Southeast Asia, would go communist. That was the domino theory. But because of these blinders, we missed the extent to which the Vietnamese people were actually fighting for their independence after having been colonized for over 1,000 years. First, and importantly, by the Chinese, really the big enemy, and then by the French. So in 1995, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, met his former counterpart, the foreign minister of Vietnam. It was these two former enemies coming together. And the former enemy said to Secretary McNamara, "You must never have read a history book. If you had, you would know that we weren't pawns of China. Don't you understand that we've been fighting China for 1,000 years? We were fighting for our independence, and we would fight for our last man, to the last man. And no amount of bombing, no amount of US pressure could have stopped us." So far from being communist China's pawn, by 1979, Vietnam was at war with China. China was actually the biggest enemy. It's not even the United States for them. When you ask them who is the great rival, it's literally the behemoth to the north that sits like a giant genie on a tiny lamp. But because we thought it was all about communism, we missed that. But we missed something almost more important, and this is something I bet many of you don't know. I mean, because if you've watched the recent films, you probably understand this part about nationalism. There was an additional ethnic dimension internal to the country, which doomed us from the beginning in the battle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. And that is that, like all the countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, where my own family's from, Vietnam had inside a market-dominant minority. And this is a term that I coined in 2003, and it refers to an ethnic minority that controls a vastly disproportionate amount of a nation's wealth. For example, the 3% Chinese in Indonesia today control about 70% of the private economy. It's very uncomfortable for Americans to deal with this type of group. We're much more comfortable with groups that are both economically and politically oppressed. We understand how to react ethically to that. But a group that is very economically strong but politically vulnerable, much, much more complicated. So in Vietnam, on the eve of our invasion, a deeply resented 1% Chinese minority known as the Hua, historically it controlled as much as 70 to 80% of the economy. They had been favored by the French, who did their divide and conquer thing. In other words, just think about it. We're coming in saying we're going to bring in capitalism. And yet what we missed was that a hugely disproportionate number of the capitalists in Vietnam were not even the Vietnamese people. They were part of this hated outsider minority, despised by the Vietnamese, both northern and southern alike. And the Chinese minority, tiny numbers, 1%, weren't just rich. They were viewed as the smug, exploitative, insular outsider group. They lived amongst themselves in a little place outside Saigon. They intermarried only with themselves, spoke their own language, went to their own schools. and openly seemed to not care about the Vietnamese people. Most of them dodged the draft and didn't even fight in the war. Because we missed this ethnic side of the angle, and part of it is racism. There are quotes where the same foreign minister said, "We were all just gooks to you." People just couldn't tell the difference. But because we missed this angle, virtually every pro-capitalist step we took in Vietnam just further inflamed popular resentment against us. America's wartime policies directly benefited this little entrepreneurial group who were the middlemen in the country. U.S. needed supplies, provisioning, networks. It was all the Chinese. Not to mention the brothels and the black market, which the Chinese also ran. Moreover, the regime that we installed was seen as incredibly corrupt and illegitimate, and again, in cahoots with these corrupt Chinese businessmen. So if we had actively wanted to turn the Vietnamese people around us, we could hardly have come up with a better formula. I'm old enough to remember in the late 70s, there were boat people. We heard of them as Vietnamese boat people. Many of them arrived in California, where I was. Unbelievably, for example, in 1978, 80% of the Vietnamese boat people were actually ethnic Chinese. And I've actually talked to students about this. They'll say they're Vietnamese, and I'll ask them, and they'll say, no, I'm Vietnamese. And I'll say, go ask your parents or your grandparents. And they'll come back, I can't believe it. And the reason they didn't admit it is because there were these ethnic cleansing programs. So people didn't want to admit it. They just said they were Vietnamese.